After everything we do for you, you still owe this family more, Mom, my son said after I babysat his kids for 11 straight hours for free. My daughter-in-law didn't even look up from her phone. I stood there holding a cold casserole dish while my back throbbed so badly I could barely breathe. Then my granddaughter whispered, "Mom says you're cheaper than daycare." That was the moment something inside me broke. The next morning, for the first time in 5 years, I didn't answer my son's 6 a.m. call. By noon, my phone was exploding. But what I discovered later that night changed everything. After everything we do for you, you still owe this family more, Mom. My son said those words while I was still standing in his kitchen holding a casserole dish that had gone cold in my hands. I remember staring at him across the marble island, trying to understand how the little boy I once carried through grocery stores on my hip had grown into a man who could say something like that without even blinking. Vanessa didn't look surprised. My daughter-in-law kept scrolling through her phone while my 8-year-old granddaughter colored quietly at the table beside her little brother. The dishwasher hummed softly in the background. A football game played somewhere in the living room. Everything looked so normal. That was the worst part. My feet ached from standing all day. I had arrived at their house a little after 6 that morning because Vanessa had an early yoga class and Daniel needed to drive downtown for a client meeting. Mason had spilled orange juice twice before breakfast. Lily had forgotten her science project at home, so I drove 20 minutes back to the school after dropping her off. I spent the afternoon folding laundry, helping with homework, cleaning crayon marks off the hallway wall, and making Daniel's favorite chicken casserole because Vanessa texted me around 4 saying she was too exhausted to cook dinner. By 8 that evening, my lower back felt like someone had tied bricks to my spine. But I still smiled when they walked through the door. That's what mothers do. Or at least that's what I had always believed. "I'm sorry," I finally asked quietly. Daniel leaned against the counter and crossed his arms. "You heard me, Mom. Vanessa and I are under a lot of pressure right now. We work nonstop, we're raising 2 kids, and honestly, it feels like you could be helping more instead of keeping score every time we ask for something." Keeping score. I almost laughed at that. 5 years. 5 full years of waking up before sunrise 3 or 4 mornings a week to take care of children that weren't mine to raise. 5 years of canceled doctor appointments, missed lunches with friends, and evenings spent too tired to cook for myself because I had already spent 10 hours taking care of everyone else. But somehow I was the selfish one. Vanessa finally looked up from her phone. "Daniel's just saying family should support each other," she said calmly. "We all make sacrifices." Her tone was smooth and gentle in that way people use when they already know they're right. I nodded slowly because I suddenly realized something standing there in that bright kitchen with my aching feet and cold casserole dish. They truly believed this. They genuinely thought I owed them unlimited access to my time, my energy, and my life simply because I loved them. Mason ran past me wearing superhero pajamas while Lily sat swinging her legs beneath the chair. "Grandma, can you come tomorrow too?" she asked sweetly. Before I could answer, Vanessa spoke for me. "Of course she can, honey. Grandma doesn't have anything else going on." The words landed softly, almost casually, but they cut deeper than Daniel's outburst. Because once upon a time, I did have things going on. Before my world slowly started revolving around theirs. Before every morning became theirs. Before every weekend became theirs. Before I stopped feeling like a woman with her own life and started feeling like unpaid staff with gray hair. I drove home that night in complete silence. Rain tapped lightly against the windshield while old jazz music played low through the speakers, but I barely heard it. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as Daniel's words replayed over and over in my mind. "You still owe this family more." At a red light, I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman staring back at me looked older than 68. Tired eyes. Thin silver hair pulled into a loose bun. A cardigan stained faintly with applesauce near the sleeve. I used to wear lipstick every day. I used to go dancing with my husband Frank on Friday nights at a little place near the river where they played Sinatra songs and served tiny crab cakes on white plates. Frank had been gone nearly 12 years now, but suddenly I could hear his voice clearer than I had in months. "Ellie," he used to say, "don't spend your whole life taking care of everybody else until there's nothing left of you." Back then, I thought he worried too much. Daniel was a good son. He hugged me every Christmas. He called on Mother's Day. He told people I was an amazing grandmother. But somewhere along the way, gratitude had quietly transformed into expectation. Then expectation transformed into entitlement. And I had been too busy trying to feel needed to notice it happening. My little blue house felt painfully quiet when I walked inside that evening. I set my purse on the kitchen table and stood there listening to the hum of the refrigerator. No cartoons playing. No children shouting. No phones buzzing with requests. Just silence. I should have enjoyed it. Instead, the silence felt unfamiliar. I opened the refrigerator and stared at the small birthday cake sitting untouched on the middle shelf. Chocolate with vanilla frosting. I had bought it for myself 3 days earlier because my birthday had come and gone without so much as a dinner invitation from Daniel or Vanessa. Around 9 that night, Daniel had texted me 2 words. Happy birthday. Then, 5 minutes later, another message arrived asking if I could come early Friday because daycare was closed for teacher training. I remember sitting alone at this same kitchen table eating grocery store cake straight from the box while answering yes. My phone buzzed suddenly, pulling me back to the present. A text from Vanessa. Tomorrow at 6 again, please. Daniel has another early meeting. No, thank you. No, hope you made it home safe. Just instructions. I stared at the message for a long time. Then another memory surfaced. Last month, Lily had climbed into my lap while Vanessa was upstairs getting ready for work. She wrapped her tiny arms around my neck and whispered innocently, "Mommy says you're cheaper than daycare." I remember freezing. Lily had smiled because she didn't understand what the sentence meant. Children rarely do. But I understood. God help me, I understood perfectly. I walked slowly toward the living room and lowered myself onto the couch with a groan. My joints ached in places that never used to hurt before. On the coffee table sat a watercolor paint set I had bought nearly a year earlier after seeing an art class advertised at the community center downtown. The brushes were still wrapped in plastic. I had missed every Wednesday class because Vanessa's work schedule changed and they needed me to stay later with the kids. Needed me. That word had controlled me for years. Needed felt so close to loved that sometimes I forgot there was a difference. Outside, rain continued tapping softly against the windows while my phone lit up again on the table. Another message from Vanessa. Please don't be late tomorrow. Mason has soccer at 4. I picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over the screen. For the first time in 5 years, I didn't answer right away. And somewhere deep inside me, beneath the guilt and exhaustion and loneliness, something small and unfamiliar finally began to wake up. I woke up at 4:45 the next morning without needing an alarm. My body had memorized their schedule long ago. For a few seconds, I lay still beneath the blankets listening to the soft creaking sounds of my old house settling in the early morning cold. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, and pale gray light filtered through the curtains beside my bed. Normally, I would already be reaching for my glasses, calculating how quickly I needed to shower before driving across town to Daniel's house. But that morning, I just stared at the ceiling. My phone sat face down on the nightstand beside me. Silent for now. I knew what would happen soon. Vanessa would send another message around 5:15, reminding me not to forget Mason's lunchbox. Then Daniel would call. Around 5:30 if I had not answered fast enough. Every morning followed the same rhythm. Their needs had become the clock my life revolved around. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last morning that belonged entirely to me. I could not. That realization hurt more than Daniel's words the night before. Slowly, I sat up, feeling stiffness crawl through my lower back and shoulders. My doctor had warned me 6 months earlier that I needed to slow down. Mild arthritis, elevated blood pressure, exhaustion. Stress compounds as we age, Eleanor, he had told me gently during my appointment. You cannot keep running yourself into the ground. I smiled politely back then and promised I would rest more. Then I left his office early because Vanessa needed me to pick up Lily from school after dance practice. I shuffled into the kitchen and filled the kettle with water. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock above the stove. Frank used to joke that the clock sounded louder whenever the house felt lonely. I never understood what he meant until after he died. The tea kettle began to whistle softly while I stood at the counter staring out the window at my tiny backyard. Fallen leaves covered the grass near the fence. My bird feeder hung crooked beside the oak tree because I had never found time to fix it. There were so many little things around the house I kept postponing. My own life had become a waiting room. I poured hot water into my favorite blue mug, the one with faded daisies painted along the rim. Frank bought it for me during a road trip through Vermont nearly 20 years ago. We stopped at a tiny pottery shop beside the highway because I saw the mug in the window and said it looked cheerful. He bought two even though we could barely afford one at the time. The matching mug shattered years ago after Daniel accidentally knocked it off the counter during a Thanksgiving dinner. I still remembered how terrible he felt. He must have been 16. "I am sorry, Mom," he kept saying while helping me clean the broken pieces. Dad loved those mugs. Back then, he noticed things like that. Back then, he noticed me. My phone buzzed sharply against the kitchen counter, pulling me back to the present. "Vanessa. 5:14 exactly. Please make sure Mason wears his blue sneakers today. Soccer pictures after school." No greeting. No question about how I was feeling after the argument. Just instructions. I stared at the message while steam curled upward from my tea. Then another message arrived. "And Lily needs poster board for science class." A few seconds later, Daniel called. His name glowed brightly across the screen. I watched it ring until voicemail picked up. The silence afterward felt strange. Heavy. My chest tightened immediately with guilt. What if they were stressed? What if Vanessa was overwhelmed? What if the children needed me? Mothers are trained to feel panic whenever someone they love might struggle, even after those same people stop protecting your heart. The phone rang again. This time I muted it and carried my tea into the living room. Morning sunlight had finally started spilling softly across the hardwood floor. Dust floated lazily through the light near the windows. I sat carefully on the couch beside the untouched watercolor set and wrapped both hands around my mug. Another vibration. Then another. 3 missed calls. 2 new texts. "Mom, where are you? Did you oversleep? Vanessa has to leave soon." I should have answered. Every part of my body had been conditioned to answer. But instead, I looked around the room slowly. Really looked at it for the first time in months. My bookshelves. The old piano near the wall with family photos stacked on top. The knitted blanket draped over the chair. Frank's fishing hat still hanging beside the hallway closet because I could never bring myself to move it. This house still carried pieces of me. Maybe that was why I had stopped spending time here. Maybe somewhere along the way, taking care of Daniel's family became easier than sitting alone with the parts of myself I no longer recognized. My phone finally stopped buzzing around 6. I let out a slow breath I did not realize I had been holding. Then, unexpectedly, I started crying. Quietly at first. Just a few tears sliding down my cheeks while I stared at the sunlight on the floorboards. I was not crying because I missed babysitting. I was crying because I realized how invisible I had become inside my own exhaustion. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being Eleanor Brooks. I became grandma, driver, cook, backup plan, emergency contact, free childcare. Useful people rarely get asked if they are tired. Around 7:30, I heard my neighbor Gloria knocking lightly at the front door. "Ellie," she called. "You home?" I quickly wiped my face before opening the door. Gloria stood on the porch wearing bright pink sneakers and holding 2 paper cups from the coffee shop down the street. Her silver curls bounced as she smiled at me. "I was heading to my water aerobics class and thought I would bring you coffee," she said. Then her expression shifted slightly. "Honey, are you all right?" I stepped aside so she could come in. Gloria had been my neighbor for almost 15 years. Widowed too. She understood silences better than most people. We sat together at the kitchen table while morning light warmed the room around us. "You know," Gloria said carefully after listening to me explain the fight with Daniel, "there is a difference between being loved and being depended on." I looked down at my coffee cup. "They need help," I whispered weakly. Gloria sighed softly. "No, Eleanor. They need convenience." Her words settled heavily inside me. I wanted to defend Daniel. I wanted to explain how hard young families have it nowadays. Daycare costs, mortgage payments, careers. But deep down, another voice quietly asked a question I had avoided for years. If I disappeared tomorrow, would they miss me or just miss what I did for them? My phone buzzed again on the table between us. Daniel this time. Gloria glanced toward the screen but said nothing. I watched it ring. Watched my son's name flash over and over again. Then the voicemail notification appeared. A minute later, another text arrived. Mom, this is not funny. Gloria reached across the table and placed her hand gently over mine. When was the last time someone took care of you, Ellie? She asked softly. I opened my mouth to answer. Nothing came out, because I honestly could not remember. The first time Daniel showed up at my house unannounced that week, I almost did not open the door. I saw his truck pull into the driveway just after noon on Thursday while I was standing at the kitchen sink watering the little basil plant near the window. My stomach tightened instantly, the same way it used to when the school principal called during Daniel's teenage years. Some habits never leave motherhood. I watched him climb out of the truck wearing dark sunglasses and his expensive charcoal coat, talking on his phone while pacing across the driveway. He looked irritated before he even reached the porch. Not worried. Not concerned. Irritated. I dried my hands slowly on a dish towel while he knocked 3 short times against the front door. Mom, he called. I know you're home. For a moment, I considered pretending I was not there. The thought shocked me. Mothers are not supposed to hide from their children. But lately, every interaction with Daniel left me feeling smaller somehow, like a piece of furniture that only mattered when it served a purpose. I finally opened the door halfway. Hi, Daniel. He pulled off his sunglasses immediately. Why have you been ignoring us? No hello. No hug. No apology for the things he said earlier that week. Just frustration. Behind him, cold November wind rattled the dead leaves across the porch steps. I folded my arms lightly against the chill. I have not been ignoring anyone, I said quietly. I just needed a few days to myself. Daniel exhaled sharply and rubbed his forehead. Mom, Vanessa had to cancel 2 client meetings because you disappeared. Do you know how embarrassing that was? There it was again. Not concern for me. Concern for inconvenience. I stepped back from the doorway. Do you want some coffee? He hesitated before nodding and walking inside. Daniel used to love this house. When he was little, he built blanket forts in the living room and begged Frank to help him hang glow-in-the-dark stars on his bedroom ceiling. Every Christmas morning he used to race barefoot down these hallways before sunrise. Now he walked through the house distracted, glancing at his phone every few seconds while Bluetooth messages flashed. Across his smartwatch, I poured coffee into 2 mugs while he stood at the counter scrolling through emails. Vanessa is overwhelmed, he said without looking up. The daycare situation has been a nightmare. I set his mug down gently. I understand that. Do you? He finally looked at me then. Because it kind of feels like you are punishing us. Punishing. I stared at him quietly. The word sat heavily between us. Daniel took a sip of coffee and immediately frowned. You bought different creamer? He asked. I almost smiled sadly. Even now, he noticed small inconveniences faster than emotional ones. I switched brands last week. He nodded absent-mindedly before sitting at the kitchen table. Sunlight filtered softly through the curtains behind him, catching strands of gray near his temples I had never noticed before. For a brief moment, he looked tired. Older. Maybe parenthood had exhausted him more than I realized. But then he spoke again. Mom, we cannot keep scrambling like this every morning. Vanessa and I both have careers. We need consistency. Need. There was that word again. I sat across from him and folded my hands together carefully. Daniel, when was the last time you asked whether I needed anything? His expression shifted slightly. What does that have to do with this? Answer the question. He looked genuinely confused. Mom, you know if you ever needed help, I would be there. I nodded slowly. Would you? Silence filled the kitchen. Somewhere outside, a dog barked faintly down the street. Daniel leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. I do not understand what is happening right now. You have always wanted to spend time with the kids. I do love spending time with them. Then what changed? I looked down at my coffee mug. The blue daisy pattern along the rim had faded over the years from thousands of washes. Frank used to tease me for refusing to throw old things away. Some things deserve to stay, I always told him. But lately I wondered whether I had confused loyalty with self-erasure. I think, I said slowly, somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like your mother and started feeling like an employee nobody paid. Daniel laughed once under his breath in disbelief. That is dramatic. Is it? I asked softly. You and Vanessa schedule my life without asking. You expect me available every holiday, every teacher workday, every sick day, every emergency. Last month I missed my own doctor appointment because Vanessa wanted a spa day with her friends. That was one time. No, Daniel. It was not. He shifted uncomfortably but stayed silent. I stood and walked toward the refrigerator, mostly because my hands had started trembling slightly. Inside sat leftovers I had cooked, but barely eaten over the past few days. Cooking for one still felt unnatural after 43 years of marriage. You know, I said quietly while staring into the refrigerator, I used to paint. Daniel blinked. What? Watercolors. Landscapes mostly. I stopped after your father died because I was busy helping with Lily after she was born. He frowned slightly, clearly unsure where the conversation was going. Okay. I closed the refrigerator door gently. Then Mason came along. Then preschool pickups. Then soccer practices. Then overnight babysitting. Then weekends. Then summers. I looked at him carefully. 5 years disappeared, Daniel. 5. His jaw tightened slightly. You are making it sound like we trapped you. Did you ever ask whether I wanted my entire life to revolve around yours? He opened his mouth to answer. Nothing came out. Because deep down, we both knew the truth. Nobody had forced me. That was what made it so complicated. Love can become a cage when guilt quietly locks the door. Daniel stood abruptly and walked toward the living room windows. Vanessa warned me this might happen, he muttered. What does that mean? He rubbed the back of his neck. She said once people retire, they start inventing problems because they are bored. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were cruel. Because they sounded rehearsed. Something Vanessa had likely said many times before. I felt suddenly exhausted. Not angry. Just tired in a deep and permanent kind of way. Do you know what Lily told me last week? I asked quietly. Daniel turned toward me. What? She said Vanessa calls me cheaper than daycare. Color drained slightly from his face. Mom, come on. Lily exaggerates things. Children repeat what they hear. He looked away immediately. That silence told me more than any explanation could have. Outside, clouds drifted slowly across the pale afternoon sky. The kitchen clock ticked steadily above the stove. Daniel finally grabbed his coat from the chair. So what now? He asked coldly. I thought about that question carefully. For years, my answer would have been immediate. I will help. I will fix this. I will come tomorrow morning. But now the words felt heavier somehow. More expensive. Now, I said quietly, I think I need to remember how to have a life that belongs to me. Daniel stared at me for several long seconds, like he no longer recognized the woman standing in front of him. Then he shook his head slowly. Vanessa was right, he muttered bitterly. You really have changed. After he left, I stood alone in the kitchen listening to the sound of his truck disappear down the street. Then I walked into the living room, picked up the watercolor paint set from the coffee table, and carefully peeled the plastic wrapping off the brushes for the very first time. The next Monday felt strangely unfamiliar without rushing out the door before sunrise. I woke naturally around 7 and lay in bed listening to rain tapping softly against the roof. For years, mornings had belonged to everyone except me. Pack lunches. Find missing shoes. Start cartoons. Pour cereal. Wipe spills. Drive across town before traffic thickened on the interstate. But that morning, the silence felt different somehow. Not lonely. Just quiet. I stayed beneath the blankets for several extra minutes, watching pale light spread slowly across the bedroom ceiling. Frank used to call rainy mornings permission slips from the universe. He believed storms gave people permission to slow down. I had forgotten what slowing down felt like. My phone had stopped buzzing constantly by then. Daniel sent only 2 short texts over the weekend. The first asked if I could take Mason to soccer practice Saturday morning. The second simply said, "Guess not." Vanessa had not contacted me at all. That silence bothered me more than I expected. Not because I missed the demands. Because after years of depending on me daily, they could disappear emotionally the moment I stopped being useful. I finally got out of bed and wandered into the kitchen wearing thick wool socks and Frank's old navy sweatshirt. The house smelled faintly like rain and coffee grounds. I brewed an entire pot just for myself and stood by the window watching water slide slowly down the glass. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson struggled to pull her trash bins back toward her garage through the wet leaves. Normally, I would have already been halfway across town by then. Instead, I grabbed my coat and umbrella and hurried outside to help her. "Well, look at you," she laughed warmly as we rolled the bins together beneath the drizzle. "I thought your son's family owned you full-time these days." The comment was lighthearted, but it still landed somewhere deep inside me. Maybe everyone had noticed what I refused to see. Back inside, I poured fresh coffee into a travel mug and drove downtown for the watercolor class I had missed nearly 20 times over the past year. The community center sat beside a small public library near the river, housed in an old brick building with ivy climbing along the side walls. My stomach fluttered nervously as I walked through the front doors carrying my unopened paint supplies. It felt ridiculous to be nervous at 68 years old, but I was. Starting over always feels embarrassing when you are older because people assume older women already know who they are. The classroom smelled faintly like paper, paint, and lemon cleaning solution. About a dozen people sat around folding tables covered with jars of brushes and watercolor palettes. Most looked around my age. A few younger. An older man wearing suspenders nodded politely at me while a woman near the windows smiled warmly. "You made it," the instructor said cheerfully after checking attendance. Her name was Patricia. I had spoken with her several times on the phone over the past year while repeatedly rescheduling. Life kept getting in the way, I admitted softly. Patricia smiled knowingly. Life usually does. I sat near the windows and carefully unpacked my supplies while rain streaked softly down the glass outside. My hands trembled slightly opening the paint tubes because I suddenly realized how long it had been since I did something purely because it made me happy. Not useful. Not necessary. Not productive for someone else. Just happy. Patricia asked us to paint something simple for the first exercise. Nothing perfect, she encouraged. Just something that feels peaceful. Peaceful. The words settled strangely inside me. Around the room, brushes began gliding softly against paper while quiet conversations floated through the classroom. I stared down at the blank white page in front of me for nearly a full minute before finally dipping my brush into pale blue paint. I painted the Lake Frank and I used to visit every fall during our anniversary trips to northern Michigan. Tiny wooden dock. Gray water. Orange trees reflecting against the shoreline. I had not thought about that lake in years. By the end of class, my fingers were stained blue and green, and for the first time in months, I realized nearly 2 full hours had passed without anyone asking me for something. No emergencies. No schedules. No demands. Just stillness. That's beautiful, the woman beside me said gently while we cleaned our brushes afterward. Her name was Carol. Widowed too. We ended up talking in the parking lot beneath our umbrellas for nearly 20 minutes about gardening, arthritis medication, and how strange retirement feels when your whole identity used to revolve around taking care of other people. My daughter moved to Seattle 3 years ago, Carol said. At first, I cried every day because nobody needed me anymore. Then one morning I realized something. What? I asked. She smiled softly. Being needed and being loved are not always the same thing. The sentence stayed with me all afternoon. Later that evening, I stopped at the grocery store on my way home and wandered slowly through aisles I usually rushed through while shopping for Daniel's family. I bought fresh salmon for dinner instead of chicken nuggets. Real flowers for the kitchen table. A loaf of rosemary. Bread from the bakery section because Frank loved rosemary bread and I suddenly missed the smell of it warming in the oven. Tiny choices. but they felt important somehow. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the rain had stopped completely. Soft golden sunset light spilled across the neighborhood, catching water droplets still clinging to tree branches. My phone buzzed just as I unlocked the front door. Daniel. I hesitated before answering. Hello. Mom. His voice sounded tense immediately. Where have you been? I glanced down at the grocery bags in my hands. Out. Silence. Then a frustrated exhale. Lily forgot her lunch today because Vanessa had to rush Mason to school, and everything has been chaos around here all week. I closed the front door quietly behind me. I am sorry to hear that. Another silence followed. He sounded almost stunned by my answer. Usually I would immediately offer solutions. I will bring groceries. I will pick up the kids tomorrow. I will fix it. But that evening, exhaustion no longer overpowered clarity. So that is it? Daniel asked sharply. You are just done helping your family? Family. Funny how that word only seemed to appear when they needed labor. I carried the grocery bags into the kitchen slowly before answering. No, Daniel. I am done disappearing. He let out another frustrated breath. Vanessa says you are acting selfish. I looked down at the fresh flowers resting gently against the counter beside the bread loaf and watercolor supplies. For years, selfishness meant any moment not devoted to someone else. But suddenly the definition no longer fit. Maybe, I said softly, I just finally remembered I exist too. He hung up without another word. I stood alone in the quiet kitchen listening to the dead line hum softly against my ear. Then I placed the phone down, took the salmon out of the grocery bag, and for the very first time in years, cooked dinner only for myself without feeling guilty about it. 3 weeks passed before I saw Lily and Mason again. That was the longest I had gone without seeing them since Mason was born, and the absence sat heavily inside the house like an unfamiliar shadow. I still woke up some mornings expecting to hear tiny footsteps racing down my hallway or cartoons playing too loudly from the living room television. Habits linger even after routines disappear. But little by little, my days had started forming new shapes around me. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I attended watercolor class with Carol. Wednesday mornings, Gloria convinced me to join her water aerobics group at the recreation center, even though I complained constantly about wearing a bathing suit under fluorescent lighting at my age. Friday afternoons became grocery store trips without rush or panic. Sometimes I bought flowers just because they looked cheerful. Sometimes I sat in the library near the river for an hour reading magazines I never used to have time for. Tiny things. Quiet things. But they slowly stitched parts of me back together. Then one chilly Saturday morning in late November, my doorbell rang unexpectedly just after 10. I opened the front door to find Lily standing on the porch, clutching her little pink backpack, while Daniel stood beside her with both hands shoved into his coat pockets. Mason sat in the truck behind them looking sleepy and cranky in the back seat. Grandma. Lily threw her arms around my waist immediately before I could even speak. Her hair smelled faintly like strawberry shampoo. I closed my eyes briefly while hugging her back. God, I had missed her. Daniel stayed awkwardly near the porch steps. Vanessa has a work conference downtown today, he explained quickly. And Mason has a fever, so his daycare will not take him Monday either. I looked up at him quietly. I see. He shifted uncomfortably beneath my silence. I know this is last minute. Last minute. Nearly every request from them had always been last minute because somewhere along the way they stopped seeing my schedule as real. Please, Lily whispered while tugging gently on my sleeve. Can we make pancakes? I looked down at her hopeful little face and felt my heart soften despite everything. None of this was the children's fault. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. Just until tonight. If that is okay. He sounded different somehow. Less confident. Less certain that I would automatically rearrange my entire life around his needs. For a moment, I considered saying no. Not to punish him. Simply because I finally understood I was allowed to have limits. But then Mason started coughing weakly inside the truck, and Lily tightened her grip around my hand. All right, I said softly. Relief flooded Daniel's face so quickly it almost hurt to watch. Thank you, he muttered. Actual gratitude. Small, rushed, uncomfortable gratitude. I had forgotten what it sounded like from him. The day passed quietly. Mason curled beneath blankets on the couch watching cartoons while I made soup from scratch, and Lily painted watercolor Christmas ornaments beside me at the kitchen table. Every now and then she glanced toward me carefully, almost as if checking whether I was still upset. Children sense tension far more deeply than adults realize. Around lunchtime, she looked up suddenly while dipping her paintbrush into red paint. "Mommy says you are mad at us." I stirred soup slowly on the stove before answering. "I am not mad at you, sweetheart." "At Daddy." Her voice sounded smaller. I walked over and sat beside her at the table. "Sometimes grown-ups hurt each other's feelings without meaning to," I said gently. Lily frowned slightly. "Like when Mason said my drawing looked weird?" I smiled softly. "Something like that." She nodded thoughtfully before returning to her painting. Children always search for simple explanations because the adult world feels too large and complicated otherwise. Later that afternoon, while Mason slept beneath blankets in the living room, Lily wandered quietly into the kitchen where I stood washing dishes. "Grandma?" "Yes, honey. Are you coming to Thanksgiving this year?" The question caught me off guard. "Of course I am." She looked relieved. "Good." Then she hesitated before lowering her voice. "Mommy said maybe you would not want to come anymore because you are acting different." I felt something cold settle quietly in my chest. Acting different. Funny how setting boundaries suddenly transforms women into strangers in other people's eyes. "Do I seem different to you?" I asked softly. Lily considered that seriously in the way children do. When they believe answers matter. "A little," she admitted. "But happier." Happier. The word nearly broke my heart. Because if an 8-year-old child could see the exhaustion disappearing from my face, how long had I been carrying it around unnoticed? That evening, after the children left, I stood alone in the kitchen rinsing pancake batter from mixing bowls while soft jazz played quietly through the radio near the windowsill. Outside, darkness settled early across the neighborhood as temperatures dropped toward freezing. My phone buzzed against the counter. "Vanessa." I hesitated before answering. "Hello. Thank you for helping today," she said quickly. Her voice sounded distracted, like she was multitasking while speaking. "Mason is feeling better now." "I am glad." Silence lingered briefly between us. Then she sighed softly. "Daniel says things have been tense lately." Tense. Such a polite word for emotional erosion. "Have they?" I asked quietly. Another pause. "Look, Eleanor," she said carefully, "I think maybe everybody got too comfortable with the routine we had." Routine. Interesting choice of words. Not relationship. Not family dynamic. Routine. "Perhaps," I answered. Vanessa lowered her voice slightly. "You have to understand something. Childcare around here costs almost $2,000 a month now. We were drowning before you started helping us." I leaned against the kitchen counter slowly. There it was. The truth hiding beneath all the emotional language about family support and sacrifice. Convenience. Financial relief. Dependence. "Vanessa," I asked quietly, "did you ever wonder what it cost me?" Silence filled the line completely. Not because she lacked intelligence. Because the question had probably never occurred to her. Finally she spoke again, softer this time. "I do not think anybody meant to take advantage of you." I looked down at my hands resting against the countertop. Hands swollen slightly from arthritis. Hands that spent years packing lunches, folding tiny socks, wiping tears, driving carpools, and reheating dinners, while my own life quietly shrank around everyone else's needs. "Most people never mean to," I said gently. After we hung up, I walked slowly into the living room and noticed something sitting near the edge of the coffee table. One of Lily's watercolor paintings. I must have forgotten to pack it into her backpack earlier. The picture showed a tiny little house beside a lake beneath a bright orange sunset. 3 stick figures stood outside holding hands. Me, Lily, Mason. Across the top, written carefully in uneven child handwriting, were the words, "Grandma's house feels calm." I sat down slowly on the couch holding that painting in my lap while the house settled quietly around me. Calm. Children always tell the truth without realizing it. And suddenly I understood something painful. My grandchildren had not only depended on me for care, they had depended on me for peace. Because somewhere beneath all the schedules and convenience and entitlement, Daniel and Vanessa had built a home so rushed and exhausted that even their children could feel the difference when they stepped inside mine. Thanksgiving arrived colder than usual that year. Frost clung to the edges of my front lawn early that morning, turning the grass silver beneath the pale sunrise. I stood at the kitchen window holding a mug of coffee and watched my breath fog lightly against the glass while the turkey roasted slowly in the oven behind me. The house smelled like sage, butter, and rosemary. For years, Thanksgiving had belonged to Daniel and Vanessa. Their house, their schedules, their oversized dining table decorated with expensive centerpieces Vanessa bought online every November. I always arrived before sunrise carrying pies and casseroles, while Vanessa rushed around giving instructions and Daniel watched football with the children. But this year, something had changed. 3 days earlier, Daniel called unexpectedly while I was leaving the community center after watercolor class. "Mom," he said awkwardly, "we were wondering if maybe we could do Thanksgiving at your house this year." I nearly stopped walking. "At my house? The kids keep asking for it," he admitted. "They say your house feels more comfortable." Comfortable. Another gentle word carrying a much larger truth beneath it. I agreed before thinking too hard about why his request made my chest ache. Part of me worried I was slipping backward into old patterns again. But another part understood this invitation felt different somehow. Less automatic. Less entitled. Since Thanksgiving dinner was still hours away, I spent the morning cooking quietly at my own pace. No frantic rushing. No text messages demanding forgotten ingredients. No pressure to perform perfection. Frank used to love slow holidays. "Nobody remembers whether the rolls matched the napkins," he would say while stealing bites of stuffing straight from the bowl. "They remember whether the house felt warm." Around noon, Gloria stopped by carrying sweet potato casserole and wearing enormous fuzzy earmuffs despite the temperature barely reaching 40 degrees. "I figured you might need emotional support," she joked while setting the casserole dish on the counter. Then she studied my face carefully. "You nervous?" I nodded honestly. "A little." Gloria leaned against the counter beside me. "Good. That means this matters to you." I stared down at the pie crust I was rolling out slowly across the floured countertop. "I do not want things to go back to how they were," I admitted quietly. Gloria's expression softened immediately. "Then do not let them." Simple advice. Harder in practice. Mothers spend decades convincing themselves love means flexibility, sacrifice, endurance. Boundaries feel unnatural after years of putting everyone else first. Around 3 that afternoon, Daniel's truck finally pulled into the driveway. Lily and Mason burst through the front door seconds later carrying overnight bags and talking over each other excitedly. "Grandma, your house smells amazing. Can I help with dessert?" "Mommy burned the marshmallows yesterday practicing." Their voices filled the quiet rooms instantly, bright and chaotic and familiar. Daniel followed behind them carrying grocery bags while Vanessa stepped carefully through the doorway balancing a bakery box in one hand and her phone in the other. She looked tired. Not polished tired like before. Real tired. Her hair sat loosely twisted into a clip instead of perfectly styled, and faint shadows darkened the skin beneath her eyes. "Hi, Eleanor," she said softly. "Thank you for hosting." Again, gratitude. Still awkward. Still unfamiliar. But present. I took their coats while the children ran toward the living room. Daniel lingered near the kitchen doorway, looking around slowly. "You changed things," he observed quietly. I glanced around the room. Fresh flowers sat on the dining table beside candles and handwritten place cards for everyone. My watercolor paintings now hung framed along the hallway wall where old family calendars used to be. Small changes. Personal changes. A little, I admitted. Dinner unfolded more peacefully than I expected. The children laughed through most of the meal while Gloria entertained Mason with exaggerated stories about raccoons stealing birdseed from her backyard. Vanessa actually relaxed enough to drink a full glass of wine without checking her phone every 5 minutes. Even Daniel seemed quieter somehow. Less distracted. Halfway through dinner, Lily suddenly looked up from her mashed potatoes. "Daddy?" Yeah, sweetheart. Can Grandma teach me painting after Christmas? Daniel glanced toward me briefly before smiling. If Grandma wants to. Such a small sentence. But hearing him acknowledge my choice instead of assuming it mattered more than he probably realized. After dessert, the children disappeared upstairs to play while Gloria eventually headed home with leftover pie packed carefully into foil containers. The house grew softer and quieter afterward beneath dim golden lamp light and the distant sound of Christmas commercials playing from the television. I stood alone at the kitchen sink rinsing dishes when Vanessa walked in carrying 2 wine glasses. Thought you might want another, she said gently. I accepted the glass carefully. For a few moments, we stood beside each other in silence while water ran softly over the dishes. Then Vanessa sighed heavily. I owe you an apology. I kept washing plates slowly. For what? She gave a tired laugh beneath her breath. Probably more than one thing. I finally turned off the faucet and looked at her fully. Vanessa stared down into her wine glass before continuing. Things have been difficult lately, she admitted quietly. After you stopped helping all the time, everything kind of fell apart. There was no accusation in her voice anymore. Just exhaustion. The daycare costs are insane, she continued. Mason got sick twice this month. Daniel missed meetings. I have been working nights after the kids go to bed just trying to keep up. I dried my hands carefully on a towel. I never wanted your lives to become harder. Vanessa looked up immediately. I know. Silence settled softly between us again. Then she said something I never expected to hear. I think I stopped seeing you as a person for a while. Her honesty startled me more than defensiveness would have. Vanessa leaned against the counter and closed her eyes briefly. You were just always there. Reliable. Calm. Every time something went wrong, you fixed it. I do not think I realized how much we were taking from you because, honestly, she laughed softly without humor. I stopped asking. The kitchen clock ticked quietly above us. Somewhere upstairs, Lily laughed loudly at something Mason said. When I was growing up, Vanessa said carefully, my mother never helped with anything. Ever. She cared more about boyfriends and vacations than me. She shrugged slightly. So when you came into our lives and wanted to help with the kids all the time, I think part of me just grabbed onto it too hard. Her voice cracked slightly at the end. I studied her carefully then. Really studied her. Not as the woman who exhausted me for years, but as another tired mother quietly drowning beneath expectations she did not know how to carry either. Pain travels through families in strange ways sometimes. I should have spoken up sooner, I admitted quietly. Vanessa shook her head immediately. No. We should have listened better. Footsteps creaked softly behind us before Daniel appeared near the kitchen doorway. He looked between us uncertainly. Everything okay? Vanessa wiped quickly beneath one eye before nodding. Yeah. Daniel hesitated awkwardly before stepping farther into the room. Mom, he said quietly, Lily wants to know if she can spend the night here tomorrow too. I waited instinctively for the assumption to follow. The expectation. The pressure. But instead, Daniel added softly, only if you want her to. I looked at my son standing there beneath the warm kitchen lights with uncertainty written plainly across his face. Not entitlement. Not frustration. Uncertainty. And for the first time in a very long while, I realized something important. Maybe boundaries had not destroyed my family after all. Maybe they had finally forced us to see each other clearly. December arrived quietly after Thanksgiving, covering the neighborhood in thin layers of frost each morning and stringing pale gray skies across most afternoons. Christmas decorations began appearing house by house along the street. Twinkling lights. Inflatable snowmen. Plastic reindeer staked into frozen lawns. Normally, I loved the season more than any other. Frank used to say I treated Christmas like a sacred event instead of a holiday. But for the first time in years, the season felt strangely peaceful instead of exhausting. Not because life had suddenly become perfect. Because I no longer spent every waking moment trying to hold everyone else together. Lily started coming over every Wednesday after school for painting lessons. Not babysitting. Not emergency childcare. Painting lessons. There was a difference, and somehow we both felt it. She sat beside me at the dining room table in oversized sweaters with little flecks of paint on her fingers while we worked quietly together beneath soft Christmas music playing through the radio. Sometimes we painted snowy barns or winter trees. Sometimes we painted completely ridiculous things like purple dogs wearing scarves. The point was never perfection. It was presence. "Grandma?" Lily asked one afternoon while carefully painting tiny snowflakes across blue paper. "Why do you smile more now?" I paused with my brush hovering above the page. Children notice emotional shifts faster than adults ever do. "Do I?" She nodded immediately. "Before, you always looked tired." The honesty nearly knocked the breath from my chest. I looked down at the watercolor in front of me, watching pale blue paint spread softly through water across the paper. "I think I said carefully, sometimes people forget they deserve rest too." Lily considered that seriously while dipping her brush into silver paint. "Mommy never rests." I glanced toward her quietly. Neither did I for a long time. Upstairs, Mason's cough echoed faintly from the guest room where he was napping beneath dinosaur blankets after staying homesick from preschool again. Over the past few weeks, the children had started spending more balanced time at my house instead of arriving only during emergencies. Daniel and Vanessa no longer dropped them off without warning or assumptions. They asked first now. They respected schedules. Tiny changes, but meaningful ones. Still, not everything had magically healed overnight. Some wounds remain tender long after apologies arrive. A few days before Christmas, I drove over to Daniel's house for Lily's school choir performance. Snow flurries drifted softly through the evening air while parents bundled in thick coats crowded into folding chairs inside the elementary school gymnasium. Daniel saved me a seat near the front beside Vanessa, who handed me hot chocolate the moment I sat down. "Extra marshmallows," she said quietly. I smiled faintly. "Thank you." We sat awkwardly side by side while children shuffled nervously onto risers beneath bright gymnasium lights. Then Vanessa suddenly spoke without looking at me. "Daniel told me about the watercolor class." "Oh, he said your paintings are really good." I glanced toward her in surprise. Vanessa gave a small shrug. "He showed me the lake one you painted." Warmth spread unexpectedly through my chest. Daniel had noticed my painting enough to show her. Such a small thing. But after years of feeling emotionally invisible, small things mattered. The choir performance itself was wonderfully chaotic. Half the children sang too loudly. One little boy sneezed directly into the microphone. Mason waved enthusiastically from the audience every time Lily looked his direction. By the end, parents laughed more than applauded. It felt human. Messy. Real. Afterward, we stood together near the school parking lot while snowflakes gathered lightly across our coats. Daniel shoved his hands into his pockets beside me. "Mom?" "Yes." He hesitated before speaking again. "I have been thinking a lot lately." I waited quietly. He stared out toward the glowing parking lot lights reflecting across the snow. "When Dad died," he said softly, "I think I panicked." The honesty in his voice surprised me. "What do you mean?" He rubbed the back of his neck slowly. "I was trying so hard to hold everything together. Work, mortgage, kids, Vanessa's career. And honestly," he laughed bitterly beneath his breath, "you made it so easy for us." Easy. There was that word again. "I stopped noticing how much you were carrying because every time things got hard, you handled them before I even had to think." Snowflakes melted quietly against the shoulders of his coat while he spoke. "Then when you stepped back," he shook his head, "everything got ugly fast." I looked at my son standing beside me beneath the cold December sky and suddenly saw something I had missed before. Fear. Not cruelty. Not malice. Fear disguised as entitlement. Fear of failure. Fear of disappointing everyone. Fear of drowning beneath adulthood without enough help. "You know," I said quietly, "your father used to feel that way too." Daniel looked over at me immediately. "Really?" I nodded. "After you were born, he worked overtime constantly because he thought being a good father meant solving every problem before anyone else noticed them." A faint smile touched my lips at the memory. One night he came home so exhausted he fell asleep sitting upright at the dinner table. Daniel laughed softly. "Sounds about right." I told him something that night. What? I looked toward the school entrance where children still poured excitedly through the doors clutching paper snowflakes and candy canes. I told him families are not supposed to survive because one person sacrifices everything. Silence settled gently between us. Then Daniel asked very quietly, "Do you think I became selfish?" The question hurt because his voice sounded genuinely uncertain. I thought carefully before answering. "No," I said softly. "I think you became comfortable." He lowered his eyes immediately because deep down, he understood the difference. Comfort creates blindness slowly, day by day, request by request, until someone's exhaustion starts looking normal. On Christmas Eve, my house filled with warmth and noise for the first time in years without leaving me emotionally drained afterward. Daniel carved the roast while Vanessa helped Lily frost sugar cookies at the kitchen table. Mason built crooked block towers beside the fireplace while old Bing Crosby songs played softly through the speakers. At one point, I stood quietly in the hallway watching everyone together beneath the warm glow of Christmas lights and realized something surprising. The atmosphere felt lighter now than it had in years. Not because everyone was happier all the time, because nobody was pretending anymore. Not me pretending endless sacrifice felt fulfilling. Not Daniel pretending dependence was gratitude. Not Vanessa pretending exhaustion made her invincible. Around midnight, after the children finally fell asleep upstairs and wrapping paper covered half the living room floor, Daniel found me alone in the kitchen packing leftovers into containers. "Mom," he said softly. I looked up. He hesitated briefly before stepping forward and pulling me into a hug. A real hug. Not distracted. Not rushed. Just quiet and sincere. "I am sorry," he whispered against my shoulder. The words settled somewhere deep inside me where resentment had lived for a very long time. I closed my eyes briefly. "I know," I whispered back. And for the first time since all of this began, I realized forgiveness does not always arrive like fireworks or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it arrives quietly in warm kitchens at midnight while snow falls softly outside and everyone finally learns how to see each other clearly again. January arrived with heavy snowstorms and the kind of bitter cold that makes old houses creak loudly at night. The holidays faded quietly after New Year's Day, leaving behind empty cookie tins, folded wrapping paper tucked into closets, and a strange sense of calm I still was not fully used to. For the first time in years, I entered a new year without exhaustion pressing against my chest like a permanent weight. My schedule finally belonged to me again. Not entirely. I still spent time with Lily and Mason every week. But now there were conversations instead of assumptions. Requests instead of demands. Some days I said yes. Some days I said no. And slowly, everyone survived both answers. One snowy Thursday morning, I sat at the dining room table painting winter trees while soft classical music played quietly through the house. Outside, thick snowflakes drifted lazily across the neighborhood, coating rooftops and sidewalks in white. My phone buzzed gently beside my paintbrush. "Vanessa, would you like to come to Lily's school art fair tomorrow night?" The message startled me more than it should have. Not because of the invitation. Because of the wording. "Would you like to?" Such small respect hidden inside ordinary language. I smiled faintly before typing back yes. The next evening, I arrived at the elementary school carrying a scarf still dusted lightly with snow. Parents crowded the hallways beneath colorful paper banners, while children dragged adults from table to table showing off science projects, clay sculptures, and paintings covered in glitter. Lily spotted me immediately near the entrance. "Grandma." She ran across the hallway wearing sparkly boots and nearly collided with my legs. "Come see mine first." She grabbed my hand excitedly and pulled me toward the gymnasium, where rows of artwork covered long display tables. Halfway there, Daniel appeared carrying Mason on his shoulders while Vanessa followed beside them balancing paper cups of hot cider. "You made it," Daniel said warmly. "Would not miss it," I answered. Lily proudly led us toward a large watercolor painting mounted near the front display. My breath caught slightly when I saw it. The painting showed a little blue house beneath falling snow with warm golden light glowing through the windows. Four figures stood outside together holding hands beneath the porch light. Above the painting, written carefully in thick marker, were the words, "The safest place I know." I stared at the picture for several long seconds before Lily looked up nervously. "Do you like it?" she asked softly. "It is beautiful," I whispered honestly. Vanessa stood beside me studying the painting quietly. She worked on it for almost 2 weeks, she admitted. Would not let anyone see it before tonight. Lily beamed proudly while Mason tugged impatiently on Daniel's coat sleeve asking for cookies from the refreshment table. Families drifted around us laughing and talking beneath fluorescent gym lights while snow continued falling outside the windows. Simple moment. Ordinary moment. Yet standing there beside my son and his family, I realized how different everything felt now compared to a year ago. Before, every interaction carried pressure hidden beneath politeness. Obligation disguised as closeness. But now there was space. Room for honesty. Room for choice. Room for me. Later that evening, after the children ran ahead toward the parking lot, Vanessa lingered beside me near the school entrance while parents bundled kids into coats and gloves around us. "I wanted to ask you something," she said carefully. I looked over. She tucked loose strands of hair behind her ears nervously before continuing. "There is a conference in Chicago next month. 3 days. Daniel cannot miss work that week." I stayed silent, waiting. Vanessa took a slow breath. "I was wondering if you would feel comfortable staying with the kids while I am gone." There it was. The kind of request that once would have immediately swallowed my entire schedule without hesitation. But now everything felt different because she waited afterward instead of assuming. Because uncertainty existed in her voice instead of expectation. Because she understood my answer might genuinely be no. "I need to think about it," I said honestly. Vanessa nodded immediately. "Of course." No guilt. No sighing. No emotional pressure. Just acceptance. Strange how respect can completely transform the same request. That night, I sat awake longer than usual thinking about her question while snow tapped softly against the bedroom windows. Part of me still feared slipping backward into old patterns. The invisible erosion that happens slowly when caregiving becomes identity instead of generosity. But another part recognized something equally important. Healthy love is not measured by endless sacrifice. It is measured by freedom. Freedom to choose. Freedom to help without disappearing. The next morning, I called Gloria while drinking coffee near the kitchen window. "Do you think people really change?" I asked her quietly after explaining Vanessa's request. Gloria laughed softly through the phone. "Honey, people change every single day. The real question is whether they change long enough for trust to grow back." I thought about that all weekend. Monday afternoon, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly while I was trimming dead branches from the rose bushes near the porch. Cold wind reddened his cheeks as he walked across the yard carrying 2 grocery bags. "Vanessa sent soup," he explained awkwardly. "You mentioned your knee was bothering you last week." I blinked in surprise. My knee had been hurting after water aerobics class, but I barely remembered mentioning it during dinner. Daniel shifted uncertainly beneath my silence. "You okay?" I smiled faintly. "Just surprised you remembered." Something flickered across his face then. "Regret maybe." "I am trying to notice things better," he admitted quietly. The honesty in his voice softened something inside me I had not realized was still guarded. We carried the groceries inside together while snow clouds gathered again outside the windows. Daniel wandered slowly through the living room looking at the watercolor paintings hanging near the fireplace. "You sold one?" he asked suddenly, noticing an empty hook near the hallway wall. I nodded. "The art gallery downtown bought it last week." He turned toward me in complete surprise. "Seriously?" I laughed softly. "Apparently people enjoy paintings of old lakes and crooked barns." "Mom, that is incredible." His pride sounded genuine. Simple words. But after years of conversations centered only around what I could provide for him, hearing my son admire something that belonged entirely to me felt unexpectedly emotional. Later, after he left, I stood alone in the kitchen unpacking soup containers into the refrigerator while evening darkness settled softly outside. My phone buzzed once more. A text from Vanessa. "No pressure about Chicago." I mean that. I stared at the message quietly for a long moment. Then I walked toward the living room where Lily's painting from the art fair now rested framed beside the fireplace. The safest place I know. I finally understood why that sentence mattered so much to me. For years, I thought being a safe place meant sacrificing endlessly until everyone else felt secure. But real safety does not come from one person carrying everyone alone. Real safety comes from relationships, where nobody has to disappear in order to be loved.